don't know if you have any questions. So, okay, Sarat.
I have one question.
Yes.
Because you asked them of their Last Supper, you
Yes.
said. But why did you ask them about their supper? Because it reminds me of the Last Supper of Jesus and stuff like that.
I'm sorry?
But when you ask them about their Last Supper, it reminds me of the Last Supper of Jesus. And
Yes.
is there a
Yes.
connection? You did it on purpose?
Yes, actually, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So why you wanted to make a link?
Yeah.
What do you think?
But like those immigrant and refugees, I mean mainly Burmese refugees you interviewed, and they are like very familiar with this religious icon.
No, I don't think so. But it's just the notion that I want to associate with, because the Last Supper, like you said, it's become like a big thing, a very important thing.
Yeah.
And for these people, I think it's that moment of that being together with the one we loved before is quite important. So just want to make that connection as well. And also in that image of the Last Supper is also a lot of moment of anxieties, that he wasn't sure what is going on in between those relationships that you see in the pictures. So I just want to draw that into my photographs as well.
Okay.
I was glad that you actually picked on the issue of the Last Supper, memory of the Last Supper, because it occurred to me while listening to you, Sopawan, that how much, again, the singularity of your viewpoint as a researcher comes through. This is not a question that a sociologist would have asked. What memory do you have of your Last Supper? The question that would be asked by the general bureaucratic order would be, what was your last port of departure? Or what was your last nationality? What was your last set of support systems, as it were? But the very particularity of this question, that it's asking such a doggedly mundane thing, a very ordinary experience is you've been asking these people to recall. But the memory of the Last Supper, of course, has itself, as a phrase, a very powerful symbolic load to it. And I think that interested me straight away, that there is the promise or the possibility or the potential for some transformation, such as one understands in the Last Supper. And it is that moment of transfiguration that is promised in the Last Supper, if one goes down the road of the symbolic order. But if you go down the road of the mundane, these are ordinary people, and you're asking them to recall a very personal, lived memory, I find that extremely interesting, that we have these two orders rubbing up against each other. And it's precisely in showing the unsquareability of these two orders that you begin to prize open space in the inquiry that would not be captured at all by someone carrying out sociological research or anthropological research or research into the legal status of these transients. So for me that is extremely interesting, because you've already possibly begun to sense that what I'm trying to say is there a particular standpoint from which an artist can begin an inquiry that is different from the narrative and analytical standpoints and the standpoint of exposition taken up in other disciplines. So I think what one is trying to argue here is that there are some specific issues that fall through the net of academic thinking, of disciplinary thinking, of established departmental thinking, which can be picked up often by art practitioners, that the very battiness of the question, the very madness or the craziness of the question might be the interesting bit here, because we're seeing 2 or 3 other issues at play here. First of all, the production of illegality that is now the dominant element in the executive sphere of contemporary society. How do we produce the illegal? This is one of the questions that we have to see. And this production takes place through a particular architecture. We refer to the ship of Rotterdam, but you know, for many years I've been getting students to draw the map of Europe as a map of detention centers. What would the map of Europe look like in which we placed each detention center that has come up and organized? Nobody's ever done this map. And the map, to be an exhaustive and complete one, for some reason I always felt should be an embroidered map. It should be done with thread and stitching. And why, I don't know, but you know, obviously I've seen various people work at this. I tried to encourage my mother to begin embroidering this, but she said her fingers were a bit too sore. So we didn't get too far with this embroidering of the map of Europe, of all the detention centers which would capture the idea of the production of illegality, the illegal, the clandestini, the sans-papiers, the so on and so forth. We have a list of terminology to go with this. So side by side this map, there is the dictionary of the illegals, as it were, the terminology through which we capture their identity. But it is not identity that Sopawan seems to be interested in, and that I found was a new element in your thinking, and a very interesting and very encouraging one. And I could only compare it, though you have you look backwards in your sources to Michel Foucault, but I was thinking that perhaps the concept of the exodus in Paulo Verno's work comes close to the notion of becoming that Sopawan is dealing with. What is that moment in the condition of movement from A to B, where one is so totally deracinated, one is so totally in a state of uprootedness, that one has left something but one hasn't arrived. It's between departure and arrival. Actually, not when they arrive and develop some sort of identity for themselves and therefore become part of the power structures of normality, but in that moment of illegality lies the uncertainty, the sense of being neither one thing or the other, and that's where your concept of la capille, la caperte comes through, sometimes open, sometimes closed, in describing the homosexual condition, or describing this in-between condition of being neither one thing or the other. And I really wanted to search for a non-Western concept through which one might interrogate and explore this situation. And it occurred to me while in Bangkok that really the logical systems of Buddhistic thought, what we call Buddhism at least, Buddhism doesn't exist as Buddhism in the Eastern traditions of thinking. Let's keep questioning systems against systems. But what is called the Nyaya Vaisheshika system, which produces an analytical, logical form of its own, quite different from the classical logical systems we associate with the origins of Western thinking in Greece, if one could speak in that sort of schematic way. And I'm thinking of the Buddha himself asked to define, well, what then is this consciousness you talk about? What is the state of critical consciousness that you're referring to? Is it this? Is it that? And he says, neti, 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 the 3 Sanskrit words, meaning not this, not that, not the other, and therefore pointing to a condition of indeterminacy. And it is this indeterminacy which refuses to settle into any actual formed position, and therefore refuses to take up an identity. That becomes the interesting point of that particular expression, which has subsequently, again, not been all that alien to thinking in the West, are traced from a whole range of thinkers in the West who have been deeply influenced by this particular phrase, neti, neti, neti. The last, perhaps, of all was John Cage, who developed a very large system of thinking around the indeterminacy of the production of sound, which is neither music nor cacophony. What would the indeterminate moment be in these positions? But again, I don't want to repeat the word indeterminate too much, as perhaps you don't want to repeat the word becoming too much, because the minute we do, these themselves become rather fixed conceptual furniture, and they become absolutely handy, as it were, aids into which we can put anything. I think there's somewhere that Deleuze says, how could we make really skin-fit concepts that I try to imagine what would a skin fit. He doesn't use the word skin fit, but he says, I don't want baggy concepts. That baggy concepts, well, it might be too prickly for us to think immediately of someone in a burqa, right? But there we are, images come to mind. Should one then in a non-burqa style think of someone in a skin-fit lycra cyclist outfit? There's another embodiment of the concept, of the fitted concept. But this still traps us in the world of conceptualization, discourse, language, and thinking through what is ready-made in language. And therefore there is always a moment when we have to go beyond that network in which we are trapped, the network of language. So again, becoming indeterminate, let's use them because we have to use words for today, but we constantly have to move beyond that. And that beyond, for me, is precisely the visual elements that are explored and gathered by Sopawan in her work. This is not visual to illustrate, this is not visual to simply give evidence to back up the concept, this is not the visual in order to fill in the concept, but this is visual again, like the phrase, memory of the Last Supper, to rub up against the linguistic and show that it is unsquarable, that there's something doggedly that remains that cannot be brought into language and will always kind of be in excess of that particular linguistic formulation. And this is why we are returned to the kind of data that you bring before us, and I think that would require an exploration of its own. I don't want to say very much more, but just simply, is the notion of the schizophrenic a problematic one with which you started? And I think we need to unpack that for our time, but of course we know that some of the most influential writing and thinking of the post-war period took place around the concept of schizophrenia. And if we think of Deleuze's Capitalism and Schizophrenia, we have one tradition of the use of what is considered mental normality or mental health, one use of this concept through which to probe the abnormality of those who consider themselves normal. And you can see we can have lots of play with these words, but quite seriously, to question that indeterminate zone between madness and civilization. There is another major line of inquiry down that road of schizophrenia. There is, of course, the 60s, which produced the work of the anti-psychiatrists, which we have not entirely unpacked in our time, in the exploration, once again, of this. But a thinker like Deleuze went to really odd moments in the history of thinking, difference in mental experience. And I'm always a bit touched. I mean, I live in Bloomsbury in London, and therefore, and just a block away from where Virginia Woolf wrote her novels, and I'm always faintly amused that he should have referred to Virginia Woolf as one of his major sources, especially the novel Mrs. Dalloway, in which Mrs. Dalloway, this very middle-class woman, was organizing a party what could appear to be more terribly English, organizing a party and very concerned about the flowers that she's going to buy. And side by side this, there is a man, Winston Smith, who is, as it were, crumbling into despair mentally. And it is the construction or the production of party consciousness, which is a dissolving kind of consciousness. In fact, I'm very surprised the powerful way in which Deleuze, it's a very French way of looking at English literature. In England, we would think, oh, how absurd and how French. We would kind of dismiss this way of thinking of someone like Virginia Woolf. We'd want to be much more firmly on the ground in treating it as literature in the English tradition of empirical thinking and so on. But what I just wanted to indicate with that is an extremely interesting concept, schizophrenia. We cannot think of contemporary Western thinking outside the notion of schizophrenia, normality, and critical consciousness. We also see with the production of illegality, the production of the schizo. And the production of the schizo is, of course, a longer discourse in the history of immigrations. We find, if we went to the mental health institutions, we find the proportion of non-white people, for example, in these mental health institutions far higher than we would expect them to. And one of the big debates in the field is, do the psychiatrists or doctors often mistake cultural difference for just what they call madness and lock you up because you're just simply different, you see. So there is some issue here that needs to be as it were explored. But obviously, in the notion of the Exodus, in the notion when Moses gets the seas to part and so on, I mean, these miracles are being performed, there is a transfiguration taking place. I think that's the metaphor we want to hold on to, which links to the metaphor of the memory of the Last Supper, that there too Christ sits with all the disciples around him and then makes this extremely earth-shaking or heaven-shaking announcement, one of you will betray me. And this, I'm sure, takes away the party mood, if there was any party mood to the event. And it's really just a kind of damp blanket over the whole thing. And everyone looks around, and if you look at all the great Renaissance paintings, you see they're all kind of eyeing each other and say, well, who's got the dagger really out for Christ? And I think the portentousness with which that statement is made, that it portends some kind of transformation, these are the various struggles we have of trying to signal this moment of the transformation of consciousness when we move from A to B, but even that seems too linear a way to put it. And this is why I suppose the Buddha got a little bit fed up and said, Nyeti, Nyeti, Nyeti. I used to imagine waving his arms around in a very Indian-y way, like I'm doing, and saying, well, you know, not that, not that, not that, not the other. So what the hell are you pointing at? And he keeps quiet at that point. Whereas the other yogis around him are all too ready to say what the absolute truth is and to give a picture of it. That is, they're talking in terms of arrival and destination. He's talking of everything left suspended in that moment of the journey out of one state into the other. But of course, I'm simplifying, because if you look at an image of, say, the god Shiva dancing, there is an image of becoming. But if you look at an image of the Buddha with a smile on his face, there is an image of being. It's already realized and static, whereas Shiva dancing is dancing the dissolution of consciousness and the cosmos. So I think that again is a very rich body of thoughts that you bring together. But why I mentioned the possibilities they suggest, but also the limitations of the discursive, the linguistic, the word-based thinking around this, is to revalidate the visual and not to see it as simply one or the other supports in the system of thinking, what will the visual take us into? What kind of intensity? I'm struggling in trying to understand this, and I don't know if I have the words, because obviously I'm saying you can't say it in words, but I'm using words to say the unsayable. What kind of intensity do we mean? What kind of precipitation do we undergo? What kind of condensation is one caught up in as one experiences this intensity of the visual, the experience, and so on? And that's where it seems to me you as a practitioner, as an artist, are bringing something new to this field of knowledge production, knowledge acquisition. If we say that visual arts today, contemporary art, is a form, is a modality of knowledge production, then we are asked the second question, what sort of knowledge? And when we move down conceptual knowledge, not quite, not this, not that, not the other, and so on, and then we have to unpack what the visual actually enables in this situation. I think that's the sort of semi-last point I want to make, and the very last one may be that Hannah Arendt had indicated that the figure of the refugee would be the figure of the 20th century, that we understand the century through the image of the refugee, the person in exodus who's left but not arrived. But of course we know that the majority of the immigrants we talk about are very keen to get there. They want to arrive. Are we romanticizing then the image of that moment of becoming? Are we deriving so much of meaning out of it that we are talking louder than the experience of the refugee himself or herself? That's the question I want to say, ask, and therefore not make too much again of the powerful symbolic cargo that the refugee holds in contemporary political discourse, that in the refugee we have begun to see all the ideals that have been missed or failed in the political sphere as we've lived it as proper citizens, that it is in the failed citizen, in the refused citizen, in the non-citizen, that there resides a body of values that we want somehow to recuperate. I think that will be a rather simplistic way of thinking of this set of issues. And why I would think that is because beyond Hannah Arendt's observation, there lies what I think I've been struggling to think about, is that the figure of our time is not anymore ultimately the figure of the refugee, but the figure of the terrorist. The figure of the terrorist must define that moment of non-communicable communication, that moment when something is being communicated, but there is a refusal to use language, there is a refusal to live, there is in fact only annihilation that is offered, only negation that is offered. Now that negation, not this world, not you, not this society, not this culture, nothing, that bomb blast of nothingness must be contrasted to the negation of neti, 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 where there is negation of a different order, a creative negation against a kind of nihilism. And I think we need to keep those as markers in our mind, and then try to understand that there are many different journeys that refugees make, and not pack them all into one highly romantic ideal and derive from it a critique only of the limitations of our society. We've got to look at it also from the point of view of the aspirations and desires of refugees themselves, and often all they want is passage from A to B, and that is the mundaneness of the question, or the mundane dimension of the question, memory of the Last Supper, that I remember this fantastic vegan meal I had. I'm assuming it in terms of my own diet. This fantastic meal I had, a vegan meal I had, and all I want to know is when could I get back to a situation where I could continue with my vegan diet and not have all the problematics of worrying about, well, has it got any animal product in it? You know, has this sugar been refined with animal bone or something quite obscure of that sort, you know, which sort of fills me with anxiety and leaves me not able to eat for days while I'm traveling, because I'm constantly suspicious of all the food around me. So that kind of total food fundamentalist paranoia that can overcome one, I think is where these big questions must come back to our own obsessions, our own particular ways of thinking, and that should give us the sense of affinity and rapport and connection with what refugees or people in this moment of exodus themselves might be desiring, and not to simply erase that and raise in a very transcendental way a big political message out of it. I think that's the unsquareabilities that I find interesting in some of the things you raise. So forgive me for going on too long.
I was hoping you were saying about Buddhism and Deleuze and
Yes, oh I see, yes. Yes, that issue worried me over many years. Deleuze himself refers to a lot of the literature. You might wonder why Deleuze, and it is a big marker in our time that certain philosophical approaches in Western thought undergo some sort of shift. In Deleuze's thinking, we have a re-engagement with the thinking of Spinoza, and here in the Netherlands, I suppose we would find very powerful resonances around that. I'm also trying to think of someone like Thomas Hirschhorn's project around Spinoza. And so don't forget the art dimension. This is not just simply critical, discursive thinking and analytical thinking that we're concerned with. We're also concerned with percept and intensities. We're forced to use language to describe what we are concerned with, and the visual, and those are things that come to be given far greater weight in, say, thinking of someone like Deleuze, and that is why perhaps we have used it, not in the rather predictable use of Deleuze by reference to his Kafka essay or reference to a minority literature and so on. These are fairly straightforward uses of it, but as you know, one of the exercises I've always set the class in Sweden in particular is to give students the footnotes to the rhizome essay. Since the rhizome essay is so discussed, everyone explains the world through the rhizome model. We see migration through the rhizome network image. We try to understand the indeterminate through the rhizome. So I said to this class, do not read this essay, cut it out and put the body of the essay into one box, and then cut the footnotes out of the essay, and cut each footnote out into a strip in the way that, say, someone like Daniel Spurley would have done, and mix it up and then drop it, and then use the strips, paste them together in an order that you'd like, and then reconstruct the essay by extrapolating from the footnotes. What would that happen? And of course, people do come up with a lot of rubbish, but nevertheless, the interesting thing is that it undermines and destabilizes the ready-made reading with which one is going to approach that particular text. It undermines the set of preconceptions with which one begins an inquiry, and that's the kind of thing that you've been concerned with. In mapping what's possible in the Netherlands, you find that, well, of course, there's a network of the NGOs already, but are the NGOs, to some extent, we're a little bit uneasy that they form a very neat counter-universe to the governmental organizations, and it is this neatness that seems to worry us, and therefore you have to begin other ways of inquiry. You have to cut out the footnotes, mix them up, throw them together, and incidentally, one person did something quite fantastic with the footnote. In footnote number 23 of Deleuze's essay, he pays great credit to an artist. I'm trying to get her name mixed up with another artist in Belgium. And he says that this artist actually, her work inspired his work. Now this is such extreme credit to pay to an artist that I said to the students, you have to find this artist. Who is this woman? Where is she? Why don't we know more about her? And one of the most zealous and one of the most dedicated students from New Zealand chased after the reference and found the artist living in a boat somewhere in between the Netherlands and Belgium. Is that possible? No? Flanders, let's put it as Flanders. I like to think it was near Maastricht. It lends some interest to the place, doesn't it? And he found her there, Joël de Cassinière. Yeah. No, Cassinière, not Julie. Yes, that's the one I'm mixing up with. De Cassinière.
Joël de la Cassinière.
Yes,
yeah,
right.
Belgian artist.
And then found her, brought her over to Sweden, and then eventually had an exhibition of the work. So this kind of research, if you think of it, is really, on the one hand, questioning the fetishism of the footnote in classical academic research. Footnotes suggest scholarship, they suggest ordered mind, they suggest a methodology of procedure and so on. But they never reclaim the life, the experience, the actual contributions of those who, as it were, might have contributed to the making up of a world of knowledge. Whereas, in this way, David was able to pursue this and actually find the footnote embodied and living from her obscurity, and to make her speak again of that engagement with one of the leading philosophers of the Western world, if I might speak like that. So maybe I leave it there. But I'm constantly trying to get back to the fact that this is research, and what is the nature of this research? That is a question which I'm hoping that many of you want to ask and want to discuss a little bit now, because we are seeing across Europe, through a standardization of the art education system, we are seeing through the Bologna process, the introduction of the BA, MA and PhD as a model for art education and the career or the making of the artist. And that is a thing that's not odd to us coming from the other side of the English Channel, but then we semi-detached from Europe. And so for us, there's been a 13-year history of doing research and PhDs in visual arts practice. There's just simply no question of that anymore in the academic world or the non-academic world. Is it possible to be a researcher through visual art? Aren't you trying to pretend you're a scientist? Aren't, all these questions which are still being debated in parts of Europe. When I say Europe, I don't mean England, please. It's a very English kind of thing about Europe. And the issue here is something you might want to explore a bit, even with Sopawan herself, since she is one of the first people to have done a PhD under the Bologna rules, and the idea of why should an artist feel that he or she can conduct an inquiry that can produce new knowledge, and what is the status of that knowledge vis-a-vis other disciplines. I think that's the issue that comes out of this, if I may institutionalize the question a bit, or put it back into the politics of the institutions of education. since so much of the other commentary I've made are on a more philosophical and more theoretical level.